process of trying to transform himself or herself.
How does one do that? How does one become better?
One absolutely crucial area is that humanity is understood as sensitivity or sensibility. It's not simply by the acquisition of knowledge from outside or refining one's rational power, but also to train oneself to become more sympathetic, more open to other possibilities.
So the point of departure for being human is empathy.
It's empathy or sympathy in that sense.
Which means
to be able to experience the suffering of others and the joy of others. To know that one is not a loner, one is always in connection. Not only in connection with other human beings, but with an ever-extending network with nature, with ecosystem.
But in the last century, Confucianism and the Chinese roots of Confucianism were so assaulted by the arrival of the West. Religion, military technology, the market economy, political institutions, and even now, in the birthplace of Confucius, the ruling principle is not religious or ethical, but communism. It's not Confucianism, it's communism. So
Right.
Are you satisfied that this cultural DNA still is infiltrating the consciousness of the Chinese today, and that you can identify with it?
Both yes and no. And this, I think, it's a story not just unique to China, but I think it's a very important story for human history as a whole. The emergence of the modern West, with emphasis on science, technology, market economy, political institutions, and so forth, what I normally call a kind of enlightenment mentality, has shaped the universe in a particular direction. In fact, all the major spheres of values in the world today, or the important spheres of interest, are very much defined by the Enlightenment mentality of the modern West. And in fact, the Chinese intellectuals, not to mention the Japanese and Korean, they are just as affected and influenced by this mentality as many of the other intellectuals in other communities. So it has become a common human heritage. The Chinese intelligentsia, whether communist or non-communist, in a sense, is being very thoroughly westernized in that sense. But this particularly powerful mentality also has sort of pushed humanity to the brink of self-destruction, with the danger of the destruction of the ecosystem as a whole.
You mean the Western?
If it is narrowly understood as wealth and power.
I started to say that you mean the Western notion of the acquisitive, possessive individual.
The social Darwinian, the Faustian drive to conquer.
And to get rich.
To get rich, to become powerful. I think when Bacon defined knowledge as power, which is a major departure from the idea of knowledge as wisdom, either in the Greek tradition or the Judaic tradition or in the Confucian tradition. So something very fundamentally changed in the human mindset, conditioned and defined by this very powerful force of modernization.
This idea of the individual and the aggression toward nature, you say is undermining our life support system.
That's right. This, of course, does not necessarily mean that the Confucian tradition has been totally undermined in terms of the form of life, patterns of human interaction, understanding of authority, of leadership, of education. Many of these things continue to develop and even flourish, not necessarily in mainland China, but in Taiwan, in Hong Kong, in Southeast Asian Chinese communities, in Chinese communities in North America.
Well, East Asia has moved to social Darwinism, it seems to me, as if it were the only game in town, and Eastern Europe threatens to be there right after them. I don't see a lot of evidence in Eastern Asia, and I'm an outsider, of course, that they're holding on to those traditions. In fact, they seem to have grabbed the capitalist appetite as their own with a vengeance.
But that does not necessarily mean that at a very deep spiritual level, they've accepted the social Darwinian mode of thinking or way of doing things as self-evidently true or even as meaningful. It's something you have to do, but it does not necessarily mean that it will give you the ultimate meaning.
The Marxists in your country, your native
Right.
country, have looked upon Confucianists as ghosts and monsters to be slain every time they rise. But I understand that your lectures in China and the articles that you've written for Chinese journals have been instrumental in in putting the Confucian question back on the agenda in China, that the communists are unable to slay these monsters and ghosts.
The question is complicated by the fact that some people believe that the problem in China today, the actual issues concerning the political culture in China, are somehow connected with the confluence of two traditions: Confucian feudalism, with too much emphasis on the group, on authority, on nepotistic concern,
hierarchy,
on rituals, and so forth, and the Stalinistic notion of dictatorship. So the marriage of these two forces constitute the brutality of the Chinese regime. And even though my sense is that description of the Confucian project is too restrictive, I think they're basically right. That's a problem. That's one of the reasons why Confucian culture, the negative side of Confucian culture, needs to be critiqued, analyzed very thoroughly to understand, to allow the more positive side that we've been discussing here to emerge.
Friends of mine who have lived in China say that as beautiful as the Confucian idea is aesthetically, in terms of form and ideality, it is nonetheless very stifling in practice, because the free spirit of the West does not feel at home in this network of kindred ties and father and son and husband and wife. You just get smothered in this tissue.
You can also say that about a highly ritualized society of South Korea or Japan or even Vietnam, because these are all societies under Confucian influence.
So Westerners admire the tradition from afar, but when they get there, they feel smothered.
That's right. But I think that's ought to be the case. That ought not to be the case, in fact. Simply because there's a major difference, even in traditional China, the debate has been going on between the Confucian idea of 5 relationships and the Confucian idea or the obligation of the 3 bonds. We know the Confucian idea of the 3 bonds is the authority of the ruler over the minister, the father over the son, and husband over the wife. So you have all these things we are fighting against by the feminists in terms of male orientation, by, of course, the liberal democratic thinkers in terms of authoritarianism, and by some scholars who think that the primordial tie between father and son will have to be overcome for the ego to be fully developed, not necessarily in the Freudian sense, but in a very broad psychoanalytic sense. But the 5 relationships, as we understand it, really talk about the mutuality in terms of basic dyadic human relationships. The relationship between father and son is defined in terms of affection, ruler and minister in terms of rightness, husband and wife in terms of division of labor, friendship in terms of trust, and sibling relationships in terms of sense of sequence. So I think within the Confucian tradition, you have the major conflict between the 5 relationships defined in terms of mutuality and support, and the 3 bonds as a kind of mechanism of ideological control.
Well, let's stop right there, because what I hear you saying is that Confucianism promotes the 3 bonds: ruler over subject, father over son.
Politicized Confucianism as an ideology of control.
All right, and father over son and husband over wife. At the same time, it promotes the 5 relationships which are a counterforce to those original impulses, but which is a way of saying that every religion contains the seeds of its own contradictory division.
Yes. So what I see is within the Confucian tradition, the continuous struggle and conflict between one type of force, especially the political leadership, that wanted to use the Confucian ethical ideas for mechanism of ideological control. What is happening now? We have to be patriotic Chinese, don't criticize the government. We have to be obedient, we work hard.